Hi everybody, my name is Nick Titus. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to everybody who put this on. I'm from Boulder, Colorado in the United States. This is my first time on foreign soil, so I'm very excited to be here. You'll have to bear with me a little bit as I am dealing with jet lag. I got in just this morning. So if anything I say sounds crazy or illegal, just blame it on the jet lag. Yeah, and I just do appreciate the thoughtfulness of everyone that I've talked to already and all the talks that are going on. It's good that there's a good group of people, a room full of people thinking about all this stuff. My personal background, back in high school, was working on an independent study, basically learning about anatomy and physiology. And going through all this process, I ended up taking an engineering course where I built a prototype of this idea that I had for an external spinal cord. Basically a little muscle stimulator hooked up with a voice control unit that allowed somebody with a paralyzed limb to say a command and stimulate that muscle. So I was working on this project back in high school, and I saw some success with a patient. I saw that it had potential, it can work. And so then I fell into the world of startups and investors and bullshit intellectual property that led me to spending about 2 years running this startup based around this technology that kind of just hit a dead end. We were unable to secure intellectual protection around what we were doing, and because of that, it didn't end up going anywhere. And so I spent a few months kind of drifting, knowing that I had a passion for these sort of problems, but not really any outlet to express that, until about a year ago I found the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective, and that led me to working on that. I now collaborate on a number of different biohacking and open source biology projects that are all humanitarian driven. So the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective is an anarchist global health group that is aimed at empowering people through information on their own bodies and on this sort of technology. So why is access to care important? All of the admirable sort of activities and things that we promote in the world that we live in are trying to allow people to realize their full human potential, to love the ones around them and all of this. But that all comes to a grinding halt when you're impaired with some sort of illness. And I'm fortunate enough to never have experienced that firsthand, but all of us know somebody who has been afflicted by some sort of illness, and it just really limits their ability to be happy and to do the things that they love and express love to those around them. Recent decades have brought innumerable new technologies into the world that have basically allowed us to solve many of the major killers that humans have had to deal with for tens of thousands of years. Most of these diseases that were killing people off, we now have cures for. The main things that we have to worry about now are cancers and chronic illnesses, but we even have treatments for those, and we have all of this stuff going. The idea of liberal humanism that has been spreading about, the idea that we can manipulate our environments, and extending that with our understanding of biotechnology, that we can manipulate ourselves, has led to this technological revolution where we know how to cure all of these diseases. So we're living in a utopia, right? Well, we're not. And the reason we're not is because there's restriction to access. We have these cures to preventable diseases, and there's people with those diseases, and thousands of them die every year. That's the system that we're living in. And that, this is just one example of that, but you see it all of the time. And these individual human stories are really touching, but it's also impactful to look at the numbers of how many things like this are going on and how many people are dying, not just in developing nations, but in the developed world as well, where there's just a lack of access to these sort of solutions. This sort of thing is not just happening in conflict zones. In the US recently, we've seen a price hike in EpiPens that's been preventative for many people who have these sort of allergies. We've also seen cures to cavities that have remained locked under patents, as well as most recently the US, where I hail from, has rolled back abortion laws to make this sort of thing much less safe in any of these states where somebody wants to have access to that sort of thing. In the US, I believe this is the result of this sort of blind worship of market principles, the idea that the market will create the world that it wants. And I'm not an expert on political theory or economics, but I don't think Homo economicus has any sort of desire to die. I don't think that's a reflection of the desires of the consumers in this system. And so what it really reflects is these bureaucracies and these institutions that have kind of stepped in the middle of this and resulted in these sort of monopolies and these restrictions to the access to these sort of things. There's also not wealthy consumers at the top who view these sort of cures, maybe there's a few, wealthy consumers at the top who view these sort of cures as a luxury and just want to keep them for themselves as a status symbol. There are very few people in this whole system that want people to die, but it's still happening. And what's sort of standing in that way? It's very easy to want to blame goons and dilettantes and charlatans and crooks that are standing in the way, and all of these individuals. It's very fun to do that, and it can be satisfyingly infuriating to go through that, but I think, at least in the purposes of this talk, it's more important to look at the bigger issue. And the bigger issue there is that those sort of free market principles that people hold so dear, if that's what they want to use to defend the system that we have, those certainly aren't present. The main bureaucracy that I'm talking about here is intellectual property. That's the primary culprit that I believe are leading to a lot of these issues, the sort of oppression that comes with the restriction of information. My company that I started failed not because we didn't have technology that was exciting and not because people didn't want it. We had users who cried the first time that they used this sort of technology. And it wasn't because it was expensive. We were able to make the prototypes for less than $100, and those were one-off units. The reason that it failed in the way that it did, it failed to be a healthcare company, was because it wasn't seen as investable because we couldn't obtain intellectual property. It wasn't that we were infringing on anyone else's ideas. It was that we couldn't prevent the state. We couldn't ask the state to step in to prevent somebody else from creating this sort of technology. And in at least the US investment startup market system, you are then seen as uninvestable if that's where you're sitting. And in the US, we also have a nice quirk of our intellectual property law that not only can you not create something for the purpose of sale, but it's illegal to create any sort of technology that is patented, even if it's for your own self-use and you're not looking to distribute it. But the Four Thieves Vinegar Collective does not observe that sort of authority. We have gone directly against this, and my laptop has died at this point, so I don't have pictures of these next sort of things. But there's a number of ways that we are kind of fighting this system, fighting the oppression of the restriction on this information related to healthcare. So the first was the Epi Pencil Project. So back when there were those spikes in the price of EpiPens, we designed a reloadable EpiPen that you could build for $30 at home and refill for $3. That was vastly less than what you could get through the existing established institutions. The FDA then came out with a response to this sort of project saying that it's not a good idea to build your own EpiPen. Ours was called an Epi Pencil, so it's a little bit different. But right after they did that, all of the EpiPens that company was creating were recalled. There were a number of dangers that were associated with them, and those are not able to be tested because they're only single use. Ours was reloadable, so you could test it to know if it wasn't going to be used. The thing is if it fails in one of these sort of situations that's dire, that's very much not a good thing. So our system had advantages over that, and we gave it out for free. We gave out the information so anybody could make this sort of thing at home. That was sort of our most notable in the press project that we were working on. The next is the Apothecary Lab, and the Apothecary Lab is a microreactor that allows you to synthesize your own pharmaceuticals at home. Great. So the Apothecary Lab allows you to create your own sort of life-saving pharmaceuticals at home. So Daraprim, which is a treatment for toxoplasmosis that is restricted both fiscally and legally in certain areas, along with naloxone hydrochloride, which is Narcan. So in areas that people are using opioids, those sort of opioids can actually be synthesized with this lab to be turned into Narcan to save lives, along with hepatitis C medication and precursor medications, precursor chemicals for creating abortion medication. These can all be created with the Apothecary Lab, which is another open source project that we've released and that we've put out there. We're not distributing these things, but we're distributing the information so that anybody could be able to make this themselves with a little bit of money and just a few mason jars putting it together, maybe access to a 3D printer. Another very exciting project that we have going on is in relation to cavities. So that's something that I alluded to before. There was this whole project that went on back in the 90s, basically where this group of researchers determined that if you genetically engineer Streptococcus, which is a bacteria that's found in your mouth that causes cavities, it clings onto your teeth. You can genetically engineer it to not create the protein that breaks down your teeth, but rather create just a little bit of alcohol, and that prevents cavities. Now, it's something that can be inoculated in babies, but once you're about 1 year old, you already have this sort of bacteria in your mouth. But they created a new strain of Streptococcus that theoretically you could brush your teeth for about 3 minutes and then you would never get another cavity because the sugar in your mouth wouldn't be able to break down your teeth in that sort of way. And it worked on about 12 people, and then the patent was sold to a dental company and nothing has happened since. It's remained locked down. Cavities lead to so many other additional health problems along with social stigmas, with the rot of teeth. It's a very essential and such an easy thing that should just be out there in the world, but it's not. And we have gone to very large extents to try and find the people that were involved with the project, but they're a little bit in hiding. So right now there's a $10,000 bounty on this sort of project that's publicly available. So if any of you are looking to make a quick buck and feel like you can solve this genetic engineering problem, we'd be really interested in talking to you. But we have a number of people in the collective who are all working on this sort of project. Theoretically, once you got it through, you could just hand out these toothbrushes that had it on, and we could wipe out cavities. And the final project that I'm going to talk about today that we're working on, we are going to be at this Biohacking Conference in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA, next, September 15th. It's a biohacking conference called Please Try This at Home. It's very exciting for a number of reasons, but what we're going to be doing there is an abortion pill workshop. So you can buy precursor chemicals that might be intended for horses originally online through veterinarian sites, and you can buy pill presses for about $10 on Amazon, and we intend to share that information with people so that they would be able to replicate and create their own abortion doses. And the chemicals are surprisingly cheap if you know how to source them correctly and safely. Doing a few simple calculations, we figured out that for about $40,000, you could create one dose for every single person in the US who's at risk of unwanted pregnancy. So we could address 10% of that population for only $4,000. So this is another workshop and project that we're working on. They're all in this same vein of bringing these sort of technologies to people. It's not necessarily about innovation. There are a lot of technocrats out there. There's a lot of people who, and I think this system of bureaucracy is kind of predicated on this idea that right around the next corner is the technological utopia that we've all been hoping for, when we're gonna live forever, when we're gonna do all these sort of things. And so in the name of that, for some reason we allow intellectual property to stifle human lives and to create this very, at best, amoral system that leads to thousands of preventable deaths every year occurring. There's some obvious counterpoints that you can make to this, but once, and this in my own ideology was a big step, once you accept the idea that there's legality and there's ethics, and those things don't always overlap, and in the case of healthcare, I think they very rarely do. Once you accept that idea, I think the main argument you can make against what we're doing is the idea of safety. And you're giving these people this information, they're not trained physicians, they're not experts, and they're gonna be working on these projects. Aren't there risks of them doing it wrong? And there certainly are. And people certainly could get hurt by doing this. We don't promote that anybody does these instead of going to a doctor, but if that's not an option, and if financially there's reasons that they can't do that, we are just providing them information to be empowered in this sort of way. The other thing is that there was a group of opioid users who were found to have Parkinson-like syndromes. And it was the result of some faulty opioids that were made by whoever had sold them this sort of thing. And when they investigated on why this happened, they went to the local library, looked into the books that had the information on opioid synthesis, and people had cut out that information to prevent those sort of instructions from being out there. And so as a result of this, the person who made this sort of thing looked at that book, didn't have the proper information, and made this faulty chemical. So I think the real risk is preventing this sort of information from being out there and not having full safety. Whatever we put out, whatever open source project we put out, we take safety into high regard, but we tend to lean towards the side of more information, and more quality information is going to be better. Sitting by and letting people die as a result of just this simple bureaucracy in the name of upholding this oppressive authority is not something that me or any of the other folks at the collective can sleep at night and do. Sea-Watch said something earlier that I think is very relevant to us too, is that what we're doing is just a stopgap. We shouldn't exist. There shouldn't be a necessity for a group like this to be out there having people making their own abortion pills. That's a sign that there is something broken in the system. All the people working on this, while they do find meaning in the work, they'd rather be doing other things. We don't want to have to focus on these sort of things, and we certainly don't want people to die. But an anarchist thinker and one of my favorite authors, Edward Abbey, has a quote which is, "Sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul." And if you all share the same sentiment with me, I would ask that you act, that you try to work towards getting this sort of information out and helping in any way you can towards that sort of goal. We're always looking for people to collaborate, so if you identify with what I've said today, no matter what your background, we can collaborate in many sorts of ways, and we can draw value from whatever sort of perspective you have. Thank you very much.